Flags made by the ladies were presented to companies. And to hear the young orators tell of how they would protect that flag, and that they would come back with the flag or come not at all, and if they fell they would fall with their backs to the field and their feet to the foe, would fairly make our hair stand on end with intense patriotism. And we wanted to march right off and whip 20 Yankees. Sam Watkins, a high private in Company H, 1st Tennessee Infantry.
When slaveholding states began seceding from the Union in protest of Abraham Lincoln's election, few Americans could have envisioned the nation would erupt in a war that would last 4 years and claim over 1 million casualties. Rather, young men throughout the South enthusiastically rushed to volunteer in local military companies. Many believed sluggishness to enlist for this 90-day frolic, as some predicted it would be, might cost them their chance at an unforgettable adventure, an opportunity to serve as many of their grandfathers had in 1776. One South Carolinian wrote,
"Our fathers severed the bonds of oppression once. Now we, for the second time, throw off the yoke and be freemen still."
The jarring dissonance between this commonplace rhetoric of fighting oppressors and the reality of fighting to establish a slaveholders' republic escaped many Confederate writers. A Mississippi soldier, for example, wrote without a hint of irony,
"If we was to lose, we would be slaves to the Yanks, and our children would have a yoke of bondage thrown around their neck."
There were also negative motivating factors to explain enlistment. To avoid ostracization was perhaps as powerful an incentive as any abstract convictions about states' rights and the legacy of the Revolution. As an NCO from Mississippi put it,
"I would much rather be numbered amongst the slain than those that stay at home, for it will be a brand upon my family's name as long as a Southern lives."
Following the siege of Fort Sumter, Abraham Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. A flurry of loyal citizens answered the call with gusto, and indeed a surplus of men crowded recruiting offices throughout the northern states. For many, idealism motivated their enlistment. Many felt it their patriotic duty to preserve the Union established by their forefathers in the Revolution. As one Union volunteer put it, "I am here as a soldier to defend the country and the Stars and Stripes. I believe that God will bless us, and if we have to fight, we shall come out victorious." Others joined to fight against the evil of slavery. As one idealistic Yankee saw it, "I believe there is an irrepressible conflict between North and South on this question. Each have their vital principle, the North liberty and the South slavery. The question is which must give away." Like so many Confederate volunteers, perhaps most of the volunteers for the Union imagined their stint as a soldier would be a glorious but brief one, expecting little more from the national scuffle than the opportunity to experience a dime novelesque adventure. War's grim truth would soon disabuse them of this notion. It wasn't all ideology or adventure-seeking that motivated enlistment. For those without work, or seasonal workers like farmers and canal boatmen, signing up was a means to earn money and have consistent meals included for one's trouble. The motivations that animated men to enlist ranged from patriotic fervor to coercion, but perhaps nothing concerned the average soldier more than his pay. When men first rushed to volunteer in the Union and Confederate armies, a private's wage was a relatively scant sum of $11 per month. In August 1861, federal Congress passed an act increasing base pay to $13 and would again see an increase in 1864 to $16 a month. Numerous forms of bounties paid out by the central and state governments provided Union men even greater economic incentives to enlist. A New York volunteer by 1863, for example, could earn $300 from the county, $75 from the state, a $100 bounty from the federal government for just enlisting, and an additional $300 if he signed for 3 years, for a total of $775. Rebel soldiers made little in comparison. For one, they wouldn't see an increase in wages until June 1864 to $18, by which time Confederate currency was utterly worthless due to widespread inflation and loss of value. Bounties were similarly anemic offerings in Dixie. In December 1861, an already cash-strapped Confederate Congress could only vote to award a $50 bounty and 6-day furlough to one-year soldiers who re-enlisted.
They keep us very strict here. It is the most like a prison of any place I ever saw. There is a high board fence around the grounds and a guard also with muskets loaded. It comes rather hard at first to be deprived of liberty. Corporal Delaraine Chapman, 93rd Illinois Infantry.
For all the anxiety about battle, in reality the soldier's life was overwhelmingly monotonous, dictated by bugle calls and demanding officers. And while the transition from civilian liberties to submitting to social equals proved difficult for many volunteers, both Billy Yank and Johnny Reb had no end of diversions, whether in camp or on the march. Soldiers frequently engaged in sports and games of various kinds, from foot and horse races to boxing and wrestling, and often gambled, much to the disdain of the regimental chaplains, some of whom seemed supernaturally gifted with the ability to sniff out games of poker, 21, and chuck-a-luck. Despite a parson's best efforts to keep the army in God's good graces, boredom drove the soldiers to bet on just about anything, even body lice.
There was one fellow who was winning all the money. His lice would run quicker and crawl faster than anybody's lice. We could not understand it. If some fellow happened to catch a fierce-looking louse, he would call on Dornan for a race. Dornan would come in and always win the stake. At last we found out Dee's trick. He always heated his plate.
Being musically inclined was one of the most appreciated skills of any recruit, as songs brought joy to even the most curmudgeonly of veterans. Tunes like The Captain with His Whiskers, The Blue-Tail Fly, and Annie Laurie were old favorites, as much as the more common patriotic tunes like Battle Cry of Freedom or Bonnie Blue Flag. Most every night before the bugle blared tattoo, the air was filled with the melody of brass bands and minstrel shows. Soldiers not only engaged in tomfoolery to satiate their boredom, they also had a number of intellectual pursuits. Most notably, soldiers would both write home to hear about how their loved ones were doing, and especially to hear about any and all news or political developments. Indeed, many unapologetically opinionated soldiers took time to write their governor as well, sharing concerns and suggestions and cluing their representatives back home in on the feeling in the army. Soldiers devoured the news, and whenever possible they enjoyed reading the enemy's newspapers too, even if it was to scoff at the ridiculous misinformation the enemy's press would have its people believe. Soldier diaries often include mention of enemy newspaper articles, usually dismissed with the curt expression, "I don't believe a word of it." Companies, regiments, and even brigades also formed debating societies. A veteran of the 20th Illinois wrote, "Interesting debate on the subject of executing the leaders of the rebellion. Made my speech on the negative. The affirmative carried by just one vote in a full house." Many soldiers viewed themselves as active participants and not mere bystanders in political matters, and occasionally regiments would send home various resolutions for publication in local papers. The 107th New York Volunteers, for example, unanimously adopted a series of resolutions for public consumption. "As officers and soldiers of every previous political party, we do deprecate and condemn the actions of traitors in the South, as well as their base and sneaking allies and abettors, the Copperheads of our own North, and that we recognize in both the same principles of political degradation and infamy, of crime and treason to our beloved country." Very few volunteers, unruly and individually minded as they were, began their military careers having any familiarity with drill. Fewer still were prepared to be subjected to strict military discipline. They were, as General P.G.T. Beauregard described them,
a mob that we have miscalled soldiers.
William J. Hardy, Confederate general and author of the most popular textbook on tactics, could only shake his head in disdain at his corps'
most wretched state of discipline and instruction.
Not only were the enlisted men disorderly, but their officers, largely untrained themselves, likewise struggled to deploy their men and coordinate their movements with other units in combat. The results in the opening battles of the war were courageous but disorganized, and disjointed attacks costing thousands of lives unnecessarily. Combat, like that experienced at Manassas and Shiloh, prompted stricter discipline in the ranks, greater competency in drill, and soon the school of the soldier took a large chunk of every man's life in the military. It was through drill, explained one Confederate witness of the debacle at Shiloh, that a soldier was turned into the
machine that works by the command of a good, bad, or indifferent engineer.
Indeed, as a Union soldier put it, that engineer, meaning the officer, dealt with some of the crookedest sticks to make straight military men of. The lessons learned in war would eventually lead General Emory Upton to create a new manual in 1867. While it still had elements of linear warfare, a higher emphasis was placed on spread-out skirmish lines and squad-based tactics rather than company or regimental-sized tactics, and would preface the future of warfare for the world.
The regiment has never yet been paid, which makes it rather tight papers with us. When the paymaster does put in an appearance, he will settle up in short order, having but one person to pay. Barney Hoops, sutler. We're all mortgaged to him. Captain Francis Donaldson of the Corn Exchange Regiment, 118th Pennsylvania.
Army regulations for both armies insisted a soldier's pay should never be in arrears over 2 months, unless the circumstances of the case render it unavoidable. Unsurprisingly, circumstances frequently did render it impossible, with pay backed up as much as 6 to 11 months. Officers and enlisted men complained bitterly about the paymaster's absence, as the longer the Army couldn't get them paid, the more desperate things became for dependents back home, and and the more likely he was to become indebted to sutlers, the merchants accompanying each regiment or settled post. Sutlers sold a wide range of essential and non-essential goods to soldiers, including food, bars of soap, reading material, and even alcohol, all at exorbitant prices. Following a hard march, a famished soldier short on rations could devour a week's wages worth of goods. But at $5 for 20 sheets of paper, $3 for a pack of envelopes, and another $3 for 5 ounces of ink, sometimes he could hardly afford to write home about it. But the soldiers had tricks of their own against the worst offenders, as all sutlers risked getting cleaned out by a disgruntled group in the middle of the night, who would then hide their newfound goods before the next day's inspection. In light of Napoleon's military truism that an army marches on its stomach, both governments, Union and Confederate, worked tirelessly to provide their armies with sufficient rations. The food a Union soldier on the march might expect consisted of sometimes fresh, but usually salted, pork or beef. Whatever meat Billy Yank got was typically accompanied with a helping of beans or peas, and small portions of sugar, coffee, vinegar, salt, and pepper. The typical Southern ration was more variable, owing to the time of year and availabilities of the base of supply. But in the spring and summer months, rebel soldiers were issued bacon, though it was often rancid, flour, peas, and salt. During the fall and winter months, Johnny Reb could hope for fresh beef, cornmeal, and rice. In all cases, salted pork was held in reserve. Army bread, called hardtack or molar breakers, was a staple of the soldiers' diet. A simple combination of flour, salt, and water, it was baked until hard to ensure a long shelf life, but also ensured that it was a difficult affair to eat without being broken up and soaked for a bit. Meager rations, often contaminated with weevils and green or rusty meats, naturally encouraged hungry soldiers with no cash or credit for the sutler to forage from the surrounding farms and woodlands. Eggs, chickens, fresh or smoked meats, vegetables, and fruits could all be easy pickings to the sticky hands of a hungry soldier. In that dreadful place, I resolved to forsake my evil ways and to serve God. I pray the Almighty to forgive me and make me pure from sin. William F. Benjamin, 4th Delaware Infantry. In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln remarked on the tragic irony that Confederates and loyal citizens of the Union alike read the same Bible and prayed to the same God, and each invoked his aid against the other. To facilitate the spiritual wants of religious soldiers, Army regulations allowed for the commissioning of a chaplain of any denomination to each regiment of infantry. Some generals worried ministers in the ranks would produce adverse effects, that their preaching about forgiveness and mercy might compromise soldiers' willingness to kill the enemy. But this was a minority view. Stonewall Jackson, himself a devout Presbyterian whose Calvinist worldview informed his generalship as much as his personal life, undoubtedly spoke for the majority of Army officers when he considered it
to be of great importance that all the regiments should have the gospel preached to them, and that they should all have chaplains.
A typical demonstration of a chaplain performing his sacred duty occurred as the famed Irish Brigade assaulted the Bloody Lane at Antietam. Father William Corby of the 88th New York gave a hasty absolution as the men were at the double quick and under enemy fire. He later recalled that
In 20 or 30 minutes, over 500 of these very men lay on the field, either dead or seriously wounded. Surrounded by dreadful casualties in the aftermath of 2nd Manassas, an aide observed to General Jackson that his men had
won this battle by the hardest kind of fighting.
Jackson curtly responded,
No, we have won it by the blessing of Almighty God.
Soldiers attached great significance to the few material objects they possessed on campaign, such as photographs and letters from home, or pocket Bibles should he be fortunate enough. But nothing was more significant to the soldier than his regiment's battle flag. The regimental colors served the important practical purpose of identifying one's regiment to other friendly units, but like the homespun commutation jacket, was also a tangible reminder to the soldier to do his manly duty to protect hearth and home, with his life if necessary. To bear the flag of one's regiment was a place of highest honor and came with a pay raise. James Murray of the 44th Massachusetts was very proud to report home to his parents that our company has been promoted to carry the colors and is now the 3rd instead of the 6th company in rank. You need not be surprised if you hear of Company C being promoted to the 1st, for we are bound to be there. We all have a great pride in our company, for a great many say that we are the best drilled in the regiment. Yet this was also the most dangerous duty, as the flag was, after all, not only symbolic of one's cause or country in an ideological sense, but it was also the most conspicuous object to be seen through the clouds of smoke on the battlefield. Little wonder the flag of the 10th Georgia was perforated with no less than 46 bullet holes at the Battle of Antietam. Casualties among the color guard were often staggering. 3 men of the 125th Pennsylvania were shot down in the few minutes they fought in the woods near Dunker Church, while no less than 8 men died carrying the colors of the 1st Texas in the Miller Cornfield. Many who fought in the war claim to lack the words necessary to describe their first combat experience.
The battle is a horrid thing. You can have no conception of its horrors,
wrote one soldier. As one awaited orders to forward march, the soldier was often overcome with dread, consumed by thoughts of family back home and of his standing before God. While the occasional nervous laughter could be heard in the line, many others uttered prayers, glimpsed at photographs, skimmed their letters, or emptied their pockets of playing cards and swore to live better lives if they could only survive this battle. Once battle commenced, it was an assault on all 5 senses. Smoke blanketed the field and obscured one's surroundings. It stung the lungs and, along with the dust from thousands of marching men, burned the eyes and parched the throat. Those who wrote of their first glimpse of the enemy in combat often spoke of the scene of masses of men moving in line formation as awe-inspiring. But any sense of admiration quickly vanished once the enemy's muskets belched their destructive fire. Ears already ringing with the beating of drums and blaring of bugles, and earth-trembling explosions near and far, he would also be subject to a hailstorm of mini-balls, canister, and shrapnel, which was an altogether different experience. Perhaps worst of all was the subsequent screaming of wounded men and horses. Little wonder then that so many soldiers wrote home in the same vein as a North Carolinian who survived Antietam.
I can't describe a battle to you. No one can imagine anything like it unless he's been in one. We could plainly hear when the order was given to advance. The flags and the long glittering line of bayonets came in sight. As with martial tread, this tremendous war machine marched to the attack. And on coming into plain view, they gave a prolonged yell and broke into a double quick towards our lines. At the proper time, our batteries opened on them with canister and shrapnel shells, which told fearfully on their crowded ranks. George Powell Clark, 36 Mississippi Infantry.
Two types of cannon predominated the Civil War battlefield: rifled guns and smoothbores. In general, the most common smoothbore in both armies was the 12-pound Napoleon, a bronze-cast gun capable of firing solid shot upwards of 1,600 yards. The rifled guns that saw use at Antietam came in various makes and models, but the most common were the sleek 3-inch ordnance rifle, with a range exceeding 1,800 yards at 5 degrees elevation, or the 10 and 20-pounder Parrott guns, with their distinctive wrought iron bands reinforcing the breech. Typically, the ammunition chests in the batteries were loaded with an assortment of 4 types of ammunition: solid shot, shell, usually detonated with a timed fuse, case shot, a shell filled with balls of shrapnel, and canister shot, a close proximity round that in the case of the Napoleon blasted 27 balls in a deadly cone out to 600 yards, 81 of them if triple loaded. In the Maryland campaign of 1862, both armies combined brought over 500 cannons to bear, and performed their service with remarkable proficiency. A Massachusetts soldier later wrote of the rebels a sentiment undoubtedly held by soldiers on both sides. "The papers say that they haven't got good gunners, but they had some good ones there that day."
My dear mother, this is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you that I died like a man. Bear my loss as best you can. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret at dying is that she is not free, and that you and my sisters are robbed of my worth, whatever that may be. I hope that this will reach you, and you must not regret that my body cannot be obtained. It is a mere matter of form anyhow. This is for my sisters too, as I cannot write more. Send my dying release to Miss Mary, you know who. J.S. Gage, Company A, 11th Mississippi. This letter is stained with my blood.
The blood-stained letter penned by Jeremiah Gage as he lay mortally wounded at a field aid station would eventually reach its intended recipients. The Miss Mary he was referencing wrote to one of Gage's sisters after to say,
"You can grieve for him as a brother, although my whole life was mapped on his love. The cold etiquette of society will not allow me to mourn for him as my betrothed. Yet you may just assume that his image will never be supplanted in my heart. You can have no idea of the dissolutions I feel. All dark as the future."
Gage's words echoed the many dying thoughts of the 3,600 who had perished on the fields of an idyllic town in Maryland in the fall of 1862, and the hundreds of thousands more that would be killed in the Civil War overall. All of them were husbands, fathers, brothers, sons, and all of them had lives and dreams that would come to a crashing end in the overheated passion of a divided nation.